In the heart of medieval Europe, power was not merely held by kings or pope as it was fought for, with crowns and crosses clashing in a struggle for supremacy. The year was 1077, and a king found himself barefoot in the snow, begging for forgiveness from the pope. His name was Henry IV, ruler of the Holy Roman Empire, and his desperate pilgrimage to the fortress of Canossa became one of history's most dramatic confrontations. This is the story of ambition and faith, of thrones and altars, of when a king and a pope changed the fate of Europe forever. The 11th century was an age of power and piety. Across the wide landscapes of Europe, castles crowned the hills, while cathedrals pierced the skies with towering spires. Life was divided between the noble and the humbly. Knights rode with banners flying, while peasants bent to the soil, tied to the rhythms of harvest and prayer. It was a world where every stone church and every village square whispered of faith, reminding all who lived within Christendom that the Church's shadow touched every soul, high or low. This was the stage upon which kings and popes would wrestle for supremacy, their struggles echoing across generations. At the heart of this world stood the Church. In monasteries and cathedrals, monks bent over parchment, preserving knowledge and scripture, while priests guided their flocks from birth to death. The Church was not only a spiritual beacon, it was a guardian of learning, a keeper of memory in an age of war and uncertainty. To many, the Pope in Rome was not merely a distant leader, but the shepherd of all souls, a voice believed to carry the will of God himself. It was this immense spiritual authority that gave the papacy its unmatched influence over kings and kingdoms alike. Yet, opposite the Church stood the kings. Crowned by God but wielding earthly swords, monarchs like Henry IV of the Holy Roman Empire saw themselves as rightful rulers over both land and men. Their courts glittered with wealth, their armies marched with steel, and their decrees shaped the lives of millions. But their authority depended not only on bloodlines and blades as it depended on legitimacy, and legitimacy often came through the Church. This fragile balance between crown and cross was always tense, and it was destined to break. The crown and the tiara, symbols of two great powers, stood side by side, yet always in competition. Kings claimed their right to rule through divine sanction, while popes asserted that spiritual authority outranked all earthly might. This rivalry was not a simple quarrel, but a fundamental question: who held the ultimate authority over Christendom? Was it the sword of the king or the keys of St. Peter? That question would soon ignite into open conflict, and the world would never forget the struggle that followed. All across Europe, this tension stretched like a bowstring. Kings relied on bishops and abbots to govern their realms, while the Pope sought to free the clergy from secular influence. It was a battle of wills, a test of pride, and a conflict of principles. In the decades to come, this struggle would plunge Christendom into chaos, shatter alliances, and give birth to one of history's most unforgettable confrontations, the showdown between Pope Gregory VII and Emperor Henry IV, the drama that would lead them both to the snows of Canossa. The seeds of conflict were sown by a man of unshakable conviction, Pope Gregory VII. Rising from humble beginnings, he believed the Church must stand above kings, free from corruption and secular control. In councils at Rome, he announced sweeping reforms. Priests could no longer marry, simony, the buying of church offices, was forbidden, and above all, it was the Pope, not kings, who would decide who wore the bishop's mitre. This challenge struck at the very heart of royal power, for kings had long claimed the right to appoint bishops who ruled lands as both lords and clergy. Henry IV, Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, refused to surrender this privilege. For him, investing bishops with staff and ring was not just tradition, it was the foundation of his authority. Bishops were not only spiritual shepherds but also feudal lords, commanding armies and revenues. To lose control over their appointments was to weaken the empire itself. Thus, Henry continued to place his chosen men into bishoprics, defying Gregory's decrees, certain that no priest could dictate terms to an emperor crowned by God. The clash could not be avoided. Gregory responded with the greatest weapon at his command, excommunication. In a thunderous decree, he declared Henry cut off from the Church, stripped of sacraments, abandoned by God. The blow was devastating. Whispers spread through the empire: could a ruler excommunicated by the Pope still be obeyed? Many of Henry's nobles, already restless under his authority, now found justification for rebellion. The emperor, once secure in his crown, suddenly found his throne trembling beneath him. This was more than a quarrel between two men, it was a battle of symbols. The papal seal represented divine authority, while the sword embodied earthly might. Europe now stood between these two forces, uncertain which would prevail. Was loyalty owed first to the emperor who wielded armies, or to the pope who held the keys to heaven? The question reverberated across the continent, testing the faith of every noble, knight, and peasant alike. The seeds of rebellion quickly took root. In Germany, princes who long resented Henry's rule rallied under the pope's decree, threatening to crown a rival king. In Italy, papal allies prepared for conflict, while Henry's supporters sharpened their swords for war. What began as a dispute over church offices had now grown into a contest for the soul of Christendom. Neither Henry nor Gregory would yield, and both knew the coming storm would decide the fate of kingship and papal power for centuries to come. Germany in the 1070s became a land divided. While Henry clung to his throne, princes and dukes seized the chance to rebel, invoking the Pope's excommunication as holy justification. The empire trembled as rival banners rose across the land. Villages were torn between loyalty to king or pope, while knights sharpened their swords in the name of faith or ambition. Winter descended harshly, freezing the rivers and muddying the roads, as if nature itself mirrored the emperor's peril. Henry IV, once secure in majesty, now stood isolated, his throne slipping from beneath him. Henry's greatest fear was not the Pope's curse alone, it was betrayal from within. His nobles, once bound by oaths of loyalty, began to waver. Many saw more profit in aligning with Gregory and his chosen rival. At council halls, whispers filled the air. Was Henry still a king, or had God's blessing left him? Even his closest allies hesitated, fearing excommunication themselves. Surrounded by doubt and treachery, Henry's crown felt heavy, his authority crumbling with every passing day. For the first time, the emperor who commanded armies and judged princes bent in desperation before the unseen power of God. In the silence of a chapel, Henry placed aside his crown and prayed for deliverance. He knew that swords could not fight excommunication, nor could decrees silence the Pope's thunder. His only path to survival lay not in battle, but in reconciliation. Pride warred with fear in his heart, yet the choice was clear. If he wished to rule again, he would have to humble himself before the very man who had cast him out. In desperation, Henry sent word to his remaining allies and, finally, to Pope Gregory himself. His letters begged for mercy, pledging obedience if only the excommunication would be lifted. Across snowy landscapes, royal messengers carried his pleas, uncertain if they would be answered. The world watched anxiously. Would the proud emperor submit, or would he raise the sword again in defiance? His fate and that of the Empyrean now hung on the Pope's response. Henry's empire was broken, his power fractured, his pride wounded. The once unshakable monarch stood on the edge of ruin, forced to confront a truth no king wished to face: that his throne depended on papal favor. In the cold heart of winter, with enemies closing in and allies abandoning him, Henry prepared for a journey that would forever mark history. A king would kneel before a pope, barefoot in the snow, to beg for absolution. The crisis of Henry IV had become the turning point of Christendom. In the harsh winter of 1077, Henry IV set out across the Alps, not as a conqueror but as a penitent. With only a handful of loyal followers, he braved the icy mountain passes, the wind cutting like blades, the snow-bearing roads and villages alike. Each step was a humiliation for a man once draped in imperial majesty. Yet Henry pressed on, for beyond the mountains lay Canossa, and with it, the chance of redemption. His crown, his throne, and his very soul depended on reaching the Pope. The journey was brutal. Storms raged across the passes, freezing men to the bone. Nobles unused to hardship stumbled beside their emperor, their silks soaked and torn. The proud trappings of royalty meant nothing here. Hunger and frost humbled them all. Yet Henry endured, walking on foot beside his horse, stripped of imperial dignity. In every freezing gust of wind, he was reminded that he was no longer a sovereign commanding men, he was a sinner seeking forgiveness. At last, Canossa rose before Henry's eyes, a fortress of stone and faith, perched upon a snowy hill in northern Italy. Within its walls stood Pope Gregory VII, resolute and unyielding. The emperor, once master of Christendom, now stood outside its gates, reduced to a petitioner. Here, history itself would be rewritten. Would the Pope open his doors, or would he leave the Emperor to freeze in the snow? The world waited to see whether power would bow to faith or faith to power. Henry cast aside his crown, his robes, his armor, barefoot in the snow, clad only in a rough tunic. He stood before the gates of Canossa. For 3 days he waited, shivering in the bitter cold, while Pope Gregory deliberated within. Each hour was a trial of body and spirit, breaking down the last remnants of imperial pride. To the world, it was the image of ultimate submission, a king stripped of power, humbled before the church. Yet for Henry, it was a desperate gamble, the only way to reclaim his throne. At last, the gates opened. The Pope received Henry, not as an equal, but as a penitent sinner. Kneeling before Gregory, Henry begged forgiveness. In that moment, the Emperor regained what armies and politics had nearly stolen in absolution. The Pope lifted the excommunication, and Henry, though humiliated, was restored to grace. The world would never forget the image of Canossa, a king kneeling barefoot in the snow, and a pope wielding the power to humble emperors. It was the triumph of spiritual authority over earthly might, or so it seemed. The emperor returned from Canossa no longer cursed but cleansed. His subjects, seeing the ban lifted, once again rallied to his side. Nobles who had abandoned him now swore renewed loyalty, eager to ride beneath his banner. To them, Henry was once again God's chosen ruler, and the stain of excommunication had vanished. Yet behind his crown and smile lingered bitterness. Though he had bent before the Pope, Henry had not forgotten the humiliation. His submission had been a mask beneath it. The fires of pride still burned. In the royal court, Henry's throne once again glittered with authority. Nobles bent the knee, bishops bowed, and the empire seemed restored. But whispers crept through the halls. Many wondered if the king's reconciliation was true repentantia, or merely a political maneuver. Henry himself gave little sign of humility. He wore his crown proudly, issued decrees with vigor, and reminded all that he was still emperor. Canossa had saved him, but it had also deepened his resentment. He would never again willingly bow before the Pope. Meanwhile in Rome, Gregory VII stood firm. He believed Canossa had been a triumph for the Church, proof that no king was above God's law. To his cardinals and to all of Christendom, he declared that emperors must obey the Pope, not the other way around. The image of Henry barefoot in the snow became a symbol Gregory wielded like a sword. But what the Pope saw as victory, Henry saw as an insult, a wound that could not be ignored. The stage was set for an even greater conflict. Soon Henry's true intentions revealed themselves. No longer humbled, he gathered armies once more, rallying loyal nobles and mercenaries to his cause. He proclaimed that the Pope had overstepped, that the crown of the empire did not belong to Rome but to God's chosen ruler himself. The emperor who had once knelt barefoot now marched in steel, sword in hand, vowing that never again would he bow. The struggle between Pope and King, once spiritual, now marched toward open war. The reconciliation at Canossa had been temporary, a fragile peace masking deeper rivalry. In truth, Henry and Gregory were bound to clash again, for neither could accept the other's supremacy. The imperial crown and the papal tiara stood as rival symbols of authority, destined to collide. Between them lay the sword, the instrument by which their conflict would be decided. The road ahead promised not peace, but war, an open struggle between throne and altar, king and pope. The fragile peace shattered. By the late 1070s, swords replaced prayers, and armies carried the weight of spiritual war. Henry IV gathered his imperial knights, while Gregory VII rallied his Eliessa princes, nobles, and bishops loyal to the papacy. The clash was not merely over land or titles, but over the soul of Christendom. Steel rang against steel as banners of empire and church faced one another in battle. The snow of Canossa was forgotten, replaced by the blood-soaked mud of war. Henry rode at the front of his men, no longer the humbled penitent but the warrior king. His crown gleamed atop his helm, a symbol that he ruled by God's will alone and not by papal command. With fire in his voice, he proclaimed that emperors were chosen by divine right, not by Rome's decree. His soldiers cheered, their faith bound not to the pope, but to their sovereign. For Henry, this was more than a war for survival, it was a war to reclaim dignity lost at Canossa. Gregory fought not with sword, but with the might of excommunication. From Rome, he thundered decrees that cursed Henry once more, stripping him of legitimacy in the eyes of the faithful. To the Pope, the emperor was no longer God's servant, but God's enemy. His words echoed through Europe, turning nobles and bishops against their king. It was a weapon no army could match, and the power to damn not just a throne, but a soul. In defiance of papal thunder, Henry marched south. By 1084, his armies surrounded Rome itself, laying siege to the Eternal City. Catapults roared, stones battered walls, and fire licked the rooftops. The emperor who had once begged barefoot in snow now brought Rome to its knees. Within the Lateran, Pope Gregory prayed for deliverance, refusing to bow. Yet the emperor's shadow loomed larger each day, until the sacred city trembled under the might of the sword. At last, Henry forced his way into Rome. In the sacred halls of St. Peter's, he set up a rival Pope Clement II who crowned him emperor once more. The throne of St. Peter was defiled by politics, torn between two claimants. Gregory VII, betrayed and abandoned, fled into exile, carried away by Norman allies. What began as a clash of faith ended as a spectacle of power, with the emperor triumphant but Christendom fractured. The war between throne and altar had scarred Europe forever. History remembers Henry IV into image as the first, the humbled ruler barefoot in the snow, begging forgiveness from the Pope. Second, the armored emperor who stormed Rome and set up a rival pope. These images reveal the paradox of his reign: humility born of necessity, pride born of power. Canossa became a tale of both weakness and strength, of a king who bowed but never truly surrendered. It is this duality that ensured his name would echo through the ages. 4 centuries after, monks and scholars copied the story of Canossa into their chronicles. To the Church, it was proof of papal supremacy at the day when even emperors bowed before God's vicar on earth. To others, it was a cautionary tale of pride and politics. The tale spread across Europe, shaping how rulers and popes alike understood their roles. It was not merely an event of one winter, but a lesson that echoed in parchment and ink for generations. The struggle of Canossa did not end with Henry and Gregory. For centuries, kings and popes wrestled over who held the greater authority. Could an emperor appoint bishops, or was that the sole right of the Church? Could the Pope excommunicate a ruler, or was the crown beyond his reach? These questions outlived both men, shaping the balance of power in Europe. Canossa was not an ending, it was the beginning of a larger conflict between throne and altar. Though Henry and Gregory's struggle was bitter, it changed Europe forever. Neither side gained complete victory. The papacy remained powerful, yet kings grew stronger in their own realms. The Holy Roman Empire weakened, but new forms of governance began to take root. Out of their clash came a reshaping of medieval politics, a fragile balance between church and state. Canossa was both a tragedy and a turning point, leaving behind scars but also paving the way for change. Today, the ruins of Canossa still stand in Italy, silent witnesses to that fateful winter. Though centuries have passed, the snow of Canossa remains etched in Europe's memory. It reminds us that power is fragile, that even emperors and popes are but men shaped by pride, faith, and circumstance. The story of Henry IV and Gregory VII is not merely medieval, it is timeless. For wherever authority and conscience collide, the spirit of Canossa lingers, whispering lessons across the ages. The tale of Canossa is more than a chapter of medieval historia, it is a mirror of human pride, humility, and the eternal struggle for authority. Henry IV and Pope Gregory VII have long passed into dust, yet their clash shaped the very foundations of Europe. Kings would rise, popes would fall, and the question of power would echo across centuries. And so, in the snow of Canossa, we find not just the story of one king and one pope, but a timeless lesson that no crown, no throne, and no altar stands unchallenged forever.